Hello, and welcome to today's tech speaker series titled Liberty Bell, Conversation with artist Nancy Baker Cahill. My name is Hillary Brill, and I lead the Institute for Technology Law and Policy, which is a think tank here in Washington, D.C. at Georgetown Law that leads research in a variety of different areas of technology, including privacy, data governance, artificial intelligence, digital inequities, and today's topic about the intersection of technology and intellectual property. We are also a hub for any tech interest that our students here have at the law school. They can find deep expertise from our esteemed faculty on issues of technology. And we provide our Tech Law Scholars Program, which is specifically designed for students that are interested in pursuing an interest in technology law. And we're a convener of thought leaders and policymakers. So please come to our upcoming events, come to our website. We have an event on November 2nd where we are launching the very first Georgetown Global Tech Networking Group, which is an international cohort of academics, journalists, and other thought leaders centered on technology, public interest, and global social impact. But let's talk about today. We are here because we also host a tech speaker series, and we have Nancy Baker Cahill as our tech speaker. She's an artist. She is working at the intersection of fine art, new media, and activism. She's a founder and artistic director of Fourth Wall, a free augmented reality public art platform exploring resistance and inclusive creative expression. But we also have our professor, Amanda Lewandowski, Associate Professor of Law and the founding director of the Intellectual Property and Policy Clinic, IPIP, at Georgetown Law. She is going to be moderating, and I'm going to be turning it over to Amanda to start this conversation, which you've been waiting for. And again, thank you for coming. Amanda.
I am so delighted to be here today. Thank you so much, Hillary, for that wonderful introduction. We are here with Nancy Baker Cahill, an artist, as Hillary already said, who is going to be talking about her Liberty Bell project. And I am so thrilled because I have experienced Liberty Bell myself. I've gone down to the reflecting pool and seen it in DC. And as soon as I saw it, I said, we need to have a conversation with her here at Georgetown. And rather than try to talk about just the kind of incredible visual experience, Nancy, you actually brought a video that will do a much better job of explaining the wonder of Liberty Bell than I ever could. So maybe we could turn over to that.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you so much, Hillary. I'm so delighted to be here and excited to talk about this. So I'm just going to quickly screen share, and I will show you the BFA did this amazing video about the project, and it actually does a better job even than I can of explaining. So here we go. The concept of Liberty Bell was originally inspired by the cracked bell itself in Philadelphia, which was named Liberty Bell by abolitionists. But also, in this incredibly divided and divisive moment, it's an opportunity to examine this founding ideal, given the structural inequality that we have, who experiences liberty, and how. Liberty for whom? The process of making Liberty Bell was very collaborative. In the beginning, I did a lot of ideation, did analog renderings at each of the given sites. Then I drew the drawings in VR. I worked with Ana Luisa Petrisco on the soundscapes. We then gave those assets to my tech partners at Drive Studios. We translated them into AR, and then they were coded into the app and geolocated with additional collaborators at each of the 6 sites. Augmented reality, or AR, is an incredible medium for public art, in my opinion, because first of all, it does absolutely no environmental harm, and it is largely accessible to a broad public through the use of smartphones and tablets. Relationships that we've formed with our local partners in each city have just been incredibly, in many cases, moving and emboldening and enriching to the project. Sorry, there we go.
there's so much there about the actual technical aspects, but before we dive into the technical pieces, I am so curious about all of the different issues and topics that are bundled up in this single work. How did you get started? What came first to you? The theme, the audio, the visual, the sights? How did you layer those different elements to create the experience that is Liberty Bell?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you for asking. As with all of my projects, the first thing is the idea. And I was really excited, and I guess it was about 18 months ago when our production fund approached me about a project in Philadelphia, actually, at the time, and said, you know, we'd love to work with you and collaborate and do an AR project, a public art project there. What would be interesting to you? What would you like to do? And I've been thinking a lot over really, not just since, for many, many years, but certainly in a really concentrated way since 2016, about civil war, about cultural civil war, about polarization, about many of the topics that have come into full focus even just recently. Obviously, couldn't have anticipated the pandemic, but certainly, or the incredible civil unrest and protests that followed, but George Floyd's murder, but certainly structural inequality, structural racism, surveillance. I mean, a lot of the themes that really voter suppression, concerns about voter suppression, those were all top of mind. And so I started thinking about American history because as a child, I'd spent a lot of time in Philadelphia. And I remember vividly visiting the Liberty Bell and remarking even at the time that it was cracked and why did they have a cracked bell? And as I said in the video, I started really chewing on that metaphor and this idea of a broken idea and maybe an idea that was broken from the beginning. And so I just started to really grapple with that idea of liberty and what it might mean in today's, the multi-layered challenges that we live through today, and what it might mean to each individual American and immigrant. And so that was the sort of fertile ground from which these ideas started to foment. And as we discussed them more, the idea really started to take shape and expand. And at that point, our production fund said, this may be bigger than just a Philadelphia project. Would you consider other sites as well? And so, and that's when then that ideation began. And as with everything, I start with renderings and I draw them, and then because I have to visualize it first on paper. I'm still really traditional in that way. And once I've done that, I go into VR and I draw in 360 using a drawing app, where it really sort of comes to life in this very actually embodied way. And I knew from the beginning with this project, and this is important to the project, every bit as important as the visual, I knew that it had to have, because it's a bell, and because even the metaphor of a bell has, forgive this pun, it's inevitable, but it has so much resonance, right? I mean, it's so, a bell can mean so many things. It can be a celebration, it can be a warning, it can be part of a dirge, it can mark time. And so that felt really important to me too. And I have a wonderful sound collaborator here who I mentioned in the video, Ana Luisa Petrisco, and we talked about developing and designing the sound to be intimately related and married to the visual itself, so that they would be inextricably linked. And we mapped the animation with my tech team, with my partners at Drive, we mapped the animation to the sound. And from the sound, I almost wanted, my friends laugh at me when I say this, but I really wanted it to be narrative. I wanted it to have a, beginning, middle, and end. Not because I think any of this is linear, but because I wanted to engage different stages of grappling with this idea of liberty and the contested idea of liberty. So it begins as this lulling sort of, I wouldn't call it soothing perhaps, but sort of a lulling sound of tolling bells. And then they become increasingly arrhythmic and dissonant. And we'd sourced sound from, historic sources, contemporary sources, and then in a gesture and nod to the future, we included some synthetic sounds as well, and ended up blending them all into a true soundscape, because I wanted the viewer to walk through, to pace through some of those emotions or associations or feelings, whatever it generated in them, obviously not in a didactic way, and allow them to consider their own experience of liberty. Because of course, it's really an invitation to consider and grapple with the question more than it is any kind of statement about what I think it is. I really want to know, it's really a listening project. What do other people think? What has their experience been?
I love that you just described this as a listening project, because for something about a bell, there is something so just really on the nose in exactly the right way about the third piece of the project, the visual, the audio, and the experience of the person who's using the app, to actually be part of this listening moment and to really project in the same way that you're projecting an image, what they're looking for in these social justice elements. And so you laid a lot on us about the way you constructed this project. And one thing I wanted to say that I love is you have these three colors of the bell that you can see, right? Red, white, and blue. But you also have three different styles of sound, right? You have the past, present, and future. And I love that those two things are mirrored. I wanted to spend a couple more moments talking about the visual aspect, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the audio aspect. For the visual aspect, we saw a tiny moment of you drawing in AR in sort of 360, but like, what is that experience like? Talk a little bit more about your analog process. You said that you do start from a traditional place and then you take it into AR, but I don't know anything about what that process is. So I want you to walk us through it and tell us, what is it like, and how did you start figuring out your sea legs, I guess, for drawing in AR?
Oh my God, I could geek out so hard on this. Okay, well, I've always wanted to sculpt. I've always wanted to create immersive, empathic experiences for a viewer. So, and when I look back on my studio practice, whether it's through installation or immersive video or even sculpture, I've always wanted to put you inside of an experience. And so I had done the series inspired by a book on actually sexual assault and the way that trauma lives in the body by a feminist philosopher named Susan Bryson. It's called Aftermath. It's an incredible book. And it had generated a whole, series of drawings, graphite drawings that were large scale, very sort of embodied drawings I punctured them with philosophical math, and there was a whole thing. But I really wanted to take that and amplify it further. So a respected colleague said to me, why don't you try drawing in VR? And I'd never done it before, but my brother-in-law happened to have like a VR, he had a headset and some software in his garage, and I went and did it. And so I put on the headset, I opened the drawing app, and I had this, like, literally, I've described it, it really was like this moment of heart-pounding love, like immediate, like desperate, passionate love. And you get the fever, and I still have the fever. And anybody who works in VR has the fever. I'm just going to say it. Because basically you see yourself in infinite space, okay? Which is just, even psychologically, that, and you're disembodied. So you can't see your physical body. Also liberating beyond measure. And actually I've had my daughter videotape me working in VR, and I move completely differently because of course you have none of that. You don't carry all of your, the associations you have when you move through the world without this layer. Anyway, and so using this drawing app, you have these two, controllers, and you can select, just as you would like a palette, if you were painting, you select these things and you draw in space. And there's something wildly exhilarating and almost ecstatic about that experience because it's metaphysical. You see your own trace. You literally, it's almost performative, and you do it in the round. So, and you can scale up and scale down. It's really almost like playing God. And it brings out everyone's, not to be super corny here, but like your inner child. Like, you just can't believe how much fun this is, and there are no consequences. You don't like something, you erase it. So for me, it was really important in imagining a massive public artwork. What is this going to feel like to your body? What is it going to feel like if you're standing beneath it, in front of it, behind it? It has to work in 360. It has to, the only angle we didn't really account for was above, but actually you could experience it that way if you had the means to get above it. But that's, so it's, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of how you draw in VR. And then of course there's a whole process where you export that file and it becomes this digital asset, and then you import it into a gaming framework or system, and then you rework it and do post and everything else. But that's I could go on and on, but that's how it is to draw in VR.
That's fascinating, especially this idea of the sort of ecstasy of feeling disembodied, but also incredibly grounded at the same time. And I feel like you get a little bit of a sense of that as a viewer or an experiencer. I feel like viewer doesn't quite do justice to the experience of looking at Liberty Bell and listening to Liberty Bell. I would actually say that it's a really soothing and jarring process, actually, to go down to the reflecting pool and see Liberty Bell, but it's also immensely powerful, as I think you can capture a little bit in the video that you showed with us. So my question is sort of, how did you know that the reflecting pool was going to be one of the sites? Did you know that really early on? Did you know that kind of later in the process? And if not, how did you arrive at deciding to include it? What was the philosophy of including the reflecting pool there?
Well, we knew, once we decided that we were going to do multiple sites along the eastern seaboard, all of which were historically or culturally relevant, DC was a no-brainer, particularly given the current administration, particularly given this march into unchecked nationalism. I mean, I have a laundry list of reasons why we chose DC, but the reflecting pool per se, like, why not over the White House, right? Why not over, I have done some things in front of the Supreme Court, I will tell you right now. And there's a piece there right now if you want to go see it. That's a different, we'll get to that. But basically the reflecting pool itself, to me, first of all, I love the fact that it exists between the Lincoln Memorial and then of course the National Monument. But the pool itself is both a literal and a metaphoric opportunity to reflect, right? I love this idea that it would mirror, that we think of pools, it's this very kind of primitive mirror. And I also knew that the way that this piece would exist over the water, the shadows that it would cast, that it would be particularly dramatic and powerful with the monument in the background, to occlude the monument on some level and to complicate that relationship that you can't see clearly through. You can't see it as this, towering icon, but there's this idea you have to grapple with if you're going to stand in that spot and look across the pool. And that felt important.
I think that's exactly true, that it is important. And I think that part of what also adds to that environment is you are in a physical space surrounded by people, a lot of whom are tourists, and other people who are not native to DC, kind of washing in and out. But you're also surrounded by the sound of bells that, as you mentioned, get more dissonorous as they progress. And so I would love to dive into how you curated historical bells. Where does one find historical bell sounds, first of all? And how do you create new sounds and current sounds and future sounds of what a whole Liberty Bell might sound like? How do you engage in that sort of creative futurism?
Also an amazing question. And I want to just add, because you just said right before you said something I meant to say about the reflecting pool that's crucial, which is that itself is a massive public space. And for a project that is all about public access, that is a much more accessible spot than others. And because of that, because it attracts such a diversity of people, that felt like really the ideal location for that reason as well. But as for the sound, this is where I rely on my incredible collaborator. So she has a wealth of archival bells, and we tried, most of them were sourced from the historic United States. There may have been one or two that were from Europe, but that also felt like that's part of the historic story, right? That's part of that narrative. And again, I could geek out like for hours on sound design, but like sound design, what we can do with filters and with a distortion and even just cobbling together, hybridizing sound with some of the sound software that we use is, it too has that sense of infinite possibility, infinite combination and recombination. So that alone allowed us to be really very precise with what we did, but also inclusive, even just in terms of like the kinds of sounds that we either created or sourced. historically sourced.
Incredible. As we think about Liberty Bell as this artifact of AR art, it is not the only piece of AR art that you've done. You've actually done a huge series of pieces. And I think that some of the folks who are viewing have maybe not encountered AR art before, but you actually founded the Fourth Wall app as a sort of digital home, a digital curatorial studio. I don't even know what the right description of it is, but a digital studio almost for your AR pieces. So you already described a little bit about what draws you to AR as a process, but I would love to hear a little bit more about why you wanted to create an app that does this, that's accessible to anybody. And some of those pieces are collaborations and some of those are your own individual pieces. And so I would love to hear a little more about how that began.
I love the way you just described it. I might have to borrow that that phrase. That's really perfect in a way. And it is intended to be that inclusive as a home would be. I did originally develop the app to challenge, basically I'd been making these drawings in VR, and VR, as I described, is an incredibly powerful tool, an incredibly powerful medium, but it is largely inaccessible. There's a huge barrier to entry, not just to create with VR, but to share it and to experience it. Now, that's breaking down little by little, but AR is way more accessible, and because of smartphones and tablets, way more democratized as an art form. So I went to my team at Drive and I basically said, hey, I want to share my VR drawings more broadly. And they said, well, we can make an app and we can translate those drawings in 360 into AR. And what we talked about was really challenging ideas around public art. How could you know, with so many institutions of permission and so many barriers to entry, and a lot of, I think, reluctance on the part of, let's say, a art world crowd to engage actively with art, how could you put drawings in the hands of complete strangers and invite them into conversation and say, well, here's a work of art which you can put anywhere you want, anywhere in the world. What would you do with it? And what ended up happening is all the, people would place the VR drawings in, hilarious settings, in, banal settings, in historic settings, in all over the globe. And this was obviously thrilling and was really inspiring, and just in terms of like what you can harness in terms of the imagination when you invite that conversation with, and it becomes a kind of a collaboration of sorts. And that was extraordinary. And then a friend of mine who's an activist and an artist, Tanya Aganiga, who does a lot of work at the border, one day was down at the border in Tijuana, and she put one of my drawings in the United States and pulled it through the border wall into Tijuana. And it was a game-changing moment. I saw that and I thought, wow, this actually, we could really, there are political opportunities here, and opportunities for really, really thoughtful discourse around urgent issues. And that birthed the Coordinates platform, which is another part of the app. So one part of the app is you take my drawings, you put them anywhere you want. Now they're animated, they cast shadows, you can record them, you can store them. But then there's the Coordinates platform, and that, what the very first foray was in 2018, and I went to a bunch of my respected friends here in LA and said, artists, all super rigorous artists, and said, basically, if you could put your work anywhere in the world where it might have added resonance, where it might, well outside the bounds of any white box, white cube, like where would you put it where it could really speak and amplify what it is you're exploring or trying to say? And to the person, they chose the most extraordinary sites, and we geolocated, we basically took their work, translated it almost always in 2D, sometimes with sound, and geolocated them all over the globe. And that has continued with a series of AR public art exhibitions. And because the app now is pretty robust in this capacity, it allows me to host things like, Liberty Bell, and in 2019, Desert X. Those were also site-specific drawings that I had done actually in VR, and then were translated into AR that address climate change and hyperobjects and that sort of thing. So it's become this, it's really grown to be this, both a vehicle for AR public art exhibitions and collaborations with other artists, and then also a means for me to interact with strangers and then to show these larger sort of land artworks in AR. And I would just say one other thing in terms of collaboration, when we geolocate anything, especially now, I mean, COVID for sure, but even like, I referenced the Supreme Court when I wanted to put a piece in front of the Supreme Court when the Kavanaugh hearings were happening and Dr. Ford was giving her testimony, and I wanted to put a piece that addressed a number of issues in front of it. I had to rely on an on-the-ground collaborator. I had to rely on someone who didn't mind standing in front of the Supreme Court with a phone, acting a little suspicious as we toggled back and forth about like scale and location and, you know, direction. And that's been part of the incredible unexpected magic of this, is these brief, as ephemeral as the medium itself, these brief meetings of strangers toward a common goal, to accomplish something. And that's sort of something that you'd never read in the fine print and you'd never know otherwise, but it's been hugely emboldening, particularly in a moment where it's hard sometimes to feel like you've got like-minded people, or that there's, you know, a lot of hope.
And I think that's one of the things that's so fascinating about Liberty Bell and your work in general, which is a lot of it does touch on the kind of hopelessness of the political situation in which we find ourselves. But behind it is just a profound, deep well of hope that comes from collaborators. Over the course of our conversation, you've mentioned so many different collaborators, the people on the ground who are working with Liberty Bell, the folks at Art Production Fund, the artists that you used to work with in your other geolocated works in Fourth Wall, Drive Studios. I feel like so frequently there's this vision of artists that persists even after so many decades and centuries of people saying it's never been this individual genius out on their own. That vision still, that myth still persists for a lot of people, just as it does for scholars and writers. And so I would love to hear a little more about, how do you go into these collaborations? For example, let's start with Liberty Bell. How did you find collaborators on the ground that you knew could do this work? And would get the vision of what you were trying to do, even if they'd never done anything with AR or VR before?
Well, you know, part of what's crucial in any intervention, I would say, any kind of, there's an IP thing I hope we get to too in terms of site. But with any of these things, especially when you're entering any community that isn't your own, I think you have to go in with curiosity, humility, and ask, you know, people in that community, look, what would be meaningful to you? What would be appropriate? How can we work together? And first of all, does this interest you at all? That's my first thing, is, you know, by the way, is this interesting? Because if it's not, obviously it's not something I would ever impose. We would never impose. But for example, in Selma, it was, you know, really, really important. This is the site of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, of Bloody Sunday. And originally, I had imagined there might be interest in putting it over the Voting Rights Museum. But when we got into conversation with community leaders there, they said, no, you know, actually, it would be better in Songs of Selma Park because people can stand there. It's next to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, hopefully soon the John Lewis Bridge, fingers crossed. You know, and it would have added value in this particular location. And my feeling is, great, you know, if that's, and all the community engagement around that will be centered in that location for that reason. So I think a lot of it has to do with just, again, listening. What is, you know, what would be meaningful? What would be most meaningful to you? And in some cases, you know, it ends up being many, many people get involved, and somehow it never ends up being too many cooks. I don't know, maybe, like, knock on wood, that we'll keep this kind of amazing streak of good luck. But most people, I think, are really excited to do something different that challenges norms, that challenges even realities and understanding, not in the sort of alternate realities that are really dangerous, like disinformation, but how could we truly use that word augment? How can we augment an idea? How can we, and maybe this is the opportunity to say it, but I did talk to a lawyer at Stanford, a brilliant lawyer, Tishan Sasubre, about like sites. How do we, and she said, be careful discursively when you talk about sites and site activation, because this is a space that will ultimately be policed and monetized. So think about idea activation and think about a shared cultural thought space, because that actually is not containable or contained, and it's not identifiable either. And I think that's the other great opportunity, you know, not to get too far afield, but I do think that, like, when I think about these collaborations and these conversations, it's much more about which thoughts are activated than, you know, and how they might be activated and how they might be received or resisted in those locations.
That also brings up this question of the way that you've chosen to present your works. And it's in some ways a very open environment, right? That you can place these pieces anywhere and you really draw, as you said, strangers into the conversation because they can really use their own creativity that's triggered by your works to put places in, or to put art in places that are banal or funny or alarming or political, in ways that you as an artist could never think of all of those things because you're thinking of too many other thoughts to think of all of that stuff. But one of the other partners that you work with is Drive Studios, and that's specific to the way that you translate your work from drawing to an actual experience that people can view anywhere in the world using a smartphone or a tablet. And so how did that partnership develop? Because it does feel like more of it's something more than just a collaboration. It's also a partnership. How did that develop and how does that change your work? And now I'm going to give you full reign to geek out and talk about the nitty gritty of how you take something that is a drawing in physical space that's also digital space and you turn that into something that can appear in my living room through my phone.
Well, I'm so excited to talk about this. So first of all, back to your point about like the genius individual. I wish I had a coding brain, okay? And if I did, I would probably not be an artist. I would 100% be a hacker. Okay, so, but I don't have that skill, unfortunately. And so I knew that I would rely, and this has always been I mean, aside from like basic video, to do anything that's sort of outside or pushes the boundaries, I've always needed to engage someone who's much smarter in tech than I am. And I mentioned my brother-in-law earlier. Around the time when I started experimenting with VR, he and my sister had formed a VFX company, which in Hollywood, it means visual effects. And we're just beginning to get into VR. So there was this wonderful sort of parallel dance that we were doing where I was beginning to play. And I remember saying to my brother-in-law, like, and this really characterizes our entire partnership, all of us. I remember saying like, wait a second, like when I had that moment of that heart pounding, I was like, can I do this? Can I do this? Can I do this? Can I do this? And he was like, yeah, you can do whatever you want. Like it's the Wild West. Just like do it and we'll make it work. And I was like, okay, oh my God, like I have found the perfect partners because every time I've tried to push, every time I've, and I'm sure I'm not the easiest person to work with because I always want to, push up against what the limits that have been pre-established are and how can we reimagine, how can we pierce that whenever we come up against something, a wall, how do we get around it? And their answer is never like, no, we can't do that. It's always like, let's find a way. We'll figure it out. Let's do it. And I remember at one point we were trying to code, we were trying to get we were trying to do this very complex animation. And we did get to this impasse where it was kind of like, I don't know, I'm not sure the technology exists. And two, I might add, of the woman identified coders, there aren't a lot of them in tech, but I mean, there are plenty of coders, but I mean, in terms of the industry, it's a very male dominated industry. And they just sat down and figured it out. And I just felt like this is, it's part of what's also exhilarating is this partnership and the back and forth and the combination of coming up with a concept, coming up with the raw materials, and then sitting down and being I may not be doing the coding, but I'm involved in all these different stages of the production process. So sitting there and grappling over, these are tech terms, but like shaders and different colors and different animation techniques and different softwares, what's going to work. There's a project I'm working on right now. We're going to work with this animation software called Houdini. It's like the greatest thing ever. We didn't have that at art. We didn't have it a few years ago. So constantly kind of using the tools at our disposal to try and expand what's possible. And, there are limited amounts of data that, this app can only handle a certain amount of data. I remember one of the and I tend to draw in a very, very data heavy way. I mean, like sometimes like millions of marks. And so mitigating that, how do you get the app to still function? How do you get it to be, how can you keep it robust but not have it crash all the time because you've just loaded it with, because it's hosting all these exhibitions, and then it's hosting these big, massive. So I'm really lucky to work with the coders there too, who figure those things out. I, of course, would have no idea how to do that. I am very well versed in the quote back end of the app. So Dakota, my studio manager, and I can be very nimble with geolocation of 2D works. But when it comes to the really highly produced 3D works, that's a whole other endeavor. And that requires like all hands on deck at Drive. And they've also just assembled an incredible team of doers and of people who, again, really don't take no for an answer. So I'm just really lucky that, and I also, probably secretly somewhat mafiosa. I love working with my family. There's a shorthand. I don't have to, I could like grunt and they know what I'm saying, oh, she means this, so I don't know. I feel very lucky.
I feel very lucky to hear you talk about it. It's really incredible to watch you light about collaborations in that way and talk about the listening aspect of the work that you do, right? Because it isn't just you telling other people what you're looking for. It is also this learning experience of opening ourselves up and listening with humility and grace, which you mentioned earlier. And I love that you mentioned that because those are the same things that we teach students in the clinic. That's how you have to approach client work. That's how you have to approach work with your supervisors. It's a very similar relationship. And I think it's incredible that it kind of transcends disciplines from law to art to technology. I do hope that a lot of the folks who are tuning in will download Fourth Wall and either go down to the reflecting pool and try Liberty Bell for themselves, but also try it in your own home and see if you can come up with any of these playful examples to come up with, because in so many ways, we actually already live in a world that's steeped in AR. We just never really talk about it that way. And as an artist, are there other examples of AR that you can look around and find inspiration or that alarm you out in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is beginning to explode. Like, I think AR is becoming so much more, not just ubiquitous, but there are better tools now for people to generate their own work. There's Adobe Aero, there's a Doodle Lens, now that Blender is free, like you can generate 3D modeling is just so much easier than it ever was before. I remain inspired by a lot of what I see. I think the things that will alarm me have to do with the potential for slander and libel. I have had a few times when people, with all due enthusiasm have said, I want to put something over this person's house that says like, he's, any pick your colorful term. And I always say to that, like, absolutely not, not only because I don't believe in that, I don't think it's wrong. It would imagine if the tables were turned. Like, I just think that sets an unholy and terrible precedent for abuse. And I'm sure it's coming. I also think there's going to be a tremendous amount of AR junk. I think there's already a lot of advertising, which is super gimmicky and like, I don't know, maybe it's interesting for a second, but I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in the stickiness of ideas and, how can AR be used in a way that surprises you, that prompts you to think. There's a wonderful artist named Marjan Magdadam, and she does these glitch feminist goddesses, and she puts them at Art Basel, and they start off as these sort of idealized female figures, and then they just get completely warped and like swollen and sharp and jagged, and they're just like, and it's just like gorgeous to see them exploding these traditional, shall we say, ideals. So there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of people working with digital media that I think are doing really, really important work. And I love the fact that, as you said, there's blurring and that like the collaboration and risk taking can and active listening can take place across disciplines. It's also happening, I hope, in this hybrid world of art too, that there, these old antiquated paradigms are being broken down, whether they want them to or not. I think the future is interdisciplinary. I think the future is hybrid. I mean, we were talking about Donna Haraway before, and she talks about the way you get through the thick present, her words, is by working together and through active collaboration and through co-making. And I think that the co-making part that AR affords is really, really exciting, because it's not just the object, or quote, to use the tech term, the asset itself. It's the person, as you said eloquently earlier, it's the person experiencing it, the person who's recording it, who's in space and time at that moment with all those environmental conditions, whatever they might be, interacting with the piece, recording the piece, and then of course, hopefully, thinking about it afterward.
One of the things you just were talking about are other types of technologies, and the way we usually encounter them is often in the most dystopian, dissociative, depressing ways. So much of the context in which we hear about the use of technology lately has been in the context of disinformation and harassment, as you touched on, or surveillance, as you mentioned earlier. But even a project that is actually meant to be provocatively pessimistic, like Liberty Bell, really inverts our expectations of technology by centering reflection and social justice. And so I would love to hear from you about how you see a work like Liberty Bell that does that. And I hope you feel like that's a fair characterization. You should tell me if you don't. But how do you feel like a work like Liberty Bell can subvert those expectations of tech and also open up a broader conversation about what technology can make possible that isn't quite so rooted in pessimism?
Well, I think for everyone, and I would say this to artists, to lawyers, to anybody who's interested in this, these are tools. And I'm not, and there's a lot of really interesting conversation around this, like a false neutrality. And I agree. I don't think any tool is actually neutral, but I think you can take the tools that we have and use them in ways that are unexpected and subversive and unorthodox. And in many ways, at least for the artist, in my opinion, that's the call to arms, right? Is that not to just accept the way things are, but to take these things and use them subversively. And as you say, as an invertive force. One of the things that was super interesting during Desert X, and I hope this is true for Liberty Bell too. COVID has certainly disrupted this slightly, but one of the things that happened with Desert X that was shocking and surprising and really, really optimistic for me was that people would show up on site, either at the Salton Sea or at the wind farms, to experience these works. And inevitably, someone had forgotten to, download the app, or they didn't have the right generation phone, or take whatever that obstacle was. But there were generally a small group of people there already. And what happened is these impromptu communities conversations started between and among strangers, and they start sharing their ideas, sharing their content, and then they'd get performative, like they would get involved and they'd say, well, let me take a picture of you doing this. So it became this very, very active, engaged thing where people were talking to each other, versus what we normally expect of tech, which is that, you're the troll in the basement, or you're sitting on your butt, or you're not engaging with the world. This was active engagement in the world. And while that might not be as possible, you hope that people are wearing masks and they're social distancing. My hope is that they'll still continue to grapple with whatever is before them and to use the technology in that way. And this is true not just for my work, but for some of our other exhibitions, like in New Orleans at Battlegrounds, all about contested sites. I hope that people go to those locations and think about why the artist chose that work and what the artist is saying, using those works in those specific locations. Because it's all back to I know I keep harping on this, but ideas are what matter. And so if we can express those ideas in a way that's engaging and inclusive, that should be the goal, and unexpected, right? And the fact that AR allows for something to be invisible to the naked eye, that you need this visual prosthesis to see and engage with it, you can be very nimble. I mean, I've done some collaborative projects over perhaps some Trump rallies with some figures that might be holding, marionette strings. And those, you can be almost guerrilla about it. Not in the way that's libelous or slanderous, but in a way that could call attention to a moment and say, here's something else to think about when you're listening to a speech about white nationalism or something. So, I don't know, did that answer the question? I feel like maybe it didn't.
This is not a quiz.
Yeah.
Anything you say answers the question, to be honest. And you've been really on point answering the question. So don't even worry about it. One question that does have, there's no wrong answers, obviously, but there are some right answers. And I would love to know the right answers to this question. You mentioned one other artist who's working with technology, whose work you thought was really interesting, the glitch artist. Please say her name again to remind everybody, including myself.
I'm gonna butcher it but you can find her on Instagram. And there are actually a bunch of artists. She's not the only one. There are a bunch of artists but they're working in like VR, AR, digital art. So it's not all AR. AR still feels like it's still emergent. But her name is Marjan Magdadam. If I said her, if you just do like Marjan AR, Google Marjan AR, she's gonna come up. There's, Hyphen Labs, they're doing, neurospeculative Afrofeminism, a Pussy Crew, cyberfeminism. Peter Wu here in LA has done this epic gallery, which I was a part of, VR gallery that he just came up with himself, breaking all kinds of boundaries, not asking for permission, which is my favorite thing to do, is not ask permission. There's an artist named Mauritian Aliari. I'm probably butchering her name too, but she does a lot of really, really cool narrative storytelling. So, I think that it's a very, it's a really interesting space, particularly too and this occupies too, for me, the realm of science fiction, where you can explore a lot of ideas in ways that of course you can explore them through traditional media as well, but because of the philosophical vector of these technologies and what they represent, in terms of virtuality, being both present and absent, all the sort of metaphysical considerations, I think you can get really deep into questions of identity and belonging and oppression, resistance, understanding, knowability. It's all sort of right there. And so I don't know, personally, I think it's a really exciting time to be in this world, and I'm really excited to see. I'm in awe of so many of my peers. I think what they're doing is incredible.
Well, one more thing that I wanted to talk about being incredible. That's not true. There's two more things. But one more thing that I do want to talk about being incredible is, what do you have going on next? What is next for you? This project, Liberty Bell, is going to be available through July 4th of 2021. So there's plenty of opportunities for people to experience it in different ways, and potentially in different political moments. Who knows how this work will read, say, in January of next year. Perhaps it will read differently than it read in July 4th of this year. We don't know yet. But I'm really curious to hear from you about sort of, what do you have coming down the pipeline that you're allowed to talk about? I will couch it, because you did warn me that there are some things you can't talk about yet.
Well, thank you for asking. I can speak broadly about several of them. And yeah, I would just piggyback on what you said vis-a-vis Liberty Bell, to say, just, encourage people to experience it at different times. Kathleen Lynch, who is at Art Production Fund, got some incredible captures, as I said earlier, during one of the marches, and it just has a different resonance at different moments. And so, yeah, I mean, I can't wait to see what it's like on Inauguration Day. Let's see how that goes. I'm going to Selma, actually, for the first time in my life. I'm so excited, in November, and I'll be recording it there as well. And this will be post-election. So yeah, so it'll be really interesting, and we'll do some community engagement, as we always do. But what I'm really excited, I am working on some large scale land artworks for an exhibition that have to do with climate change, directly address climate change. And I also have a fellowship at the Berggruen Institute that's called Transformations of the Human. And it engages art, philosophy, and science, but specifically AI, and the intersections of where these intersections might lead toward progressive post-human values. And I have two projects I'm working on for my fellowship that I am just so excited and hype about. And they're really addressing interiority and exteriority. And one is a VR project, which actually, given COVID, we may ultimately need to expand into either a dome setting or something else where you don't necessarily have to wear the headset, but we'll see. And but it will be iterated there, and it will also involve AI. And then the second part is wearable technology. And both of these projects are really intended to be to imagine and innovate tools to help empower and protect vulnerable populations. And also to really explore questions of knowability, and how do we, and cognition, embodied cognition. So I'm super, super excited to use these technologies in ways that are, again, intended to be empowering and in direct contradistinction to how they've been used up to this point.
I think that those two new projects in particular are such powerful examples of how art has always been a way to confront power, but when we're talking about technology and power, it's so intertwined and so entrenched that I think finding space to really intervene can feel more intractable. And the way that you've done it is by using art to pull the tech back and then re-intertwining it with art And I'm so curious about how that actually works with the artificial intelligence component, because that's a sexy buzzword that I think we hear a lot, both in art and in law. And I would love to hear a little more about what that actually is going to look like for you. And especially also for wearable devices, where I think so often when we hear wearables, we either think one of two things. We think ankle monitors for people who are under surveillance, or we think of our Fitbits that are helping us know how long we're sleeping. And there's not a lot of nuance, I think, between those two extremes. So tell us a little more about what the artificial intelligence component is and how that's going to work, and a little bit more about what the wearable interest is, how that drew your attention in.
Well, I'm not allowed to talk about super specific things, but I will say that we're interested in working with algorithms that don't repeat. So, really engaging the idea of mutation. And so that's one component. And also working with it in such a way that it doesn't end up, that it only refracts, this is going to sound super abstract and it might sound like bullshit, but it's not, but it really harnessing it in this way where it reveals something unexpected at the same time that it reflects and refracts something essential about decisions and choices the viewer has made. Okay, so that's the part one. Part two, in terms of wearable technology, I will just say the following. Earlier in the pandemic, I had watched Scanner Darkly, which is based on a Philip K. Dick novel, back to science fiction. And in this movie, which is all rotoscoped, one of these cops, actually, they're narcotic cops, wear what are called scramble suits. And so basically they wear these second skins, and playing over the second skin at all time are representations of other humans, but like, every race, gender, age. So like, and they're all so fluid that you would never be able to identify the person wearing this scramble suit. And the germ of that idea has sort of seeded this other project. So in terms of wearable technology, my ideas are really outsized. They're very, I think, unfortunately, they're a little bit still in the realm of science fiction, but I want to get us to a place where you could, I don't want to get in trouble, something that is not something wearable in the sense of like a watch or an ankle bracelet, but actually something that's wearable, like, and other artists have done a lot with masks, but something even more comprehensive than that.
Incredible. That's so exciting. I can't wait to see those projects come to fruition, because you have just, you made Philip K. Dick be a part of the art. What more could one ask for from a conversation about art and technology with a bunch of law nerds? One of my final questions is bringing us back to Liberty Bell and situating it in the other work that you've been doing related to social justice. And you've already alluded to that so many times in so many different ways in this conversation, but I really wanted to get an opportunity to reflect on the sites that you chose more expressly and the ways that you saw social justice playing into each of those elements in our final few minutes together.
Oh, yeah, the locations are really, really important to me. All idea activation, considered, as I've said in other contexts, there were any number of places where this work would have had really profound resonance. Again, sorry about the now hackneyed term. But when we talked about it, resources were definitely, we had to be picky. We had to choose very carefully where we wanted to put it. And we decided that in an effort to draw this historic line from down the Eastern Seaboard, you look at Charleston, 40% of all enslaved people came through Charleston. It's also, obviously, we have Fort Sumter, the site of the original Civil War. I shouldn't say the original, the Civil War. Let's hope that that's the Civil War. But we also wanted to trace it back to the original origins, because of course there was no liberty for Indigenous people, and this country was founded on genocide. And so we wanted to start from the colonizing origins up north around Boston, and make reference obviously to the Tea Party itself. And that became even more kind of complicated and interesting around this whole idea of, right, when people were talking about looting, right? And you think about, well, this is part of the fabric of American history from the beginning. And so from there, and there are all kinds of other things to discuss about that site. From there, to trace it then, of course, to the Declaration of Independence and this Liberty Bell that was apparently rung right after. And then New York, the Rockaways presented this amazing opportunity to really engage questions again of climate change and all the ways in which that's related. And then Washington, D.C. for all the reasons we know well, and Charleston, which I just mentioned, and Selma. So you really draw this direct line. But it felt like Selma is arguably one of the most important. I can't privilege one over the other, but given that it is an election year, given that voter suppression is actively happening, and that it was in 1965 that these marches, the 3 marches led by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, I don't remember, because in the as they call it, the fire hose of news, I don't remember if it was last week or the week before, but we see that even in 2016, there all of this data was harvested targeting Black Americans, and in an attempt to suppress the vote then, and of course now, and all of the threatened militia action at the voting polls, the poll watcher. Anyway, I could go on and on. So all of them really just felt, and increasingly feel, like I know we were super intentional about our choices, and we talked them over a lot. We gave it a lot of thought and research, put a lot of thought and research into it. But even as you said, they by the day become even more salient, I feel. And again, I just did this project. I hosted, Forthwell hosted the In Plain Sight project above all kinds of detention centers. We just saw the headline this morning that there are 545 children whose parents haven't been found because we were putting children in cages. So, we want to talk about liberty. Like, we could have done a whole thing in the Southwest, actually all over the United States. The ICE detention centers are everywhere, and so are these camps. But for this project, for the Liberty Bell project, which was directly related to Liberty Bell, it felt urgent to trace that line sort of directly and historically down the Eastern Seaboard.
I think that decision has made the work so particularly urgent in this political moment, in this present moment, and gives a sort of sense of hope, even though I know that the piece is meant to reflect on the ways that liberty has not been fully realized in this country. But the way that you've positioned it, and the way that you've reflected on how tech and power and art can be voices in this conversation, and it really brings it home to the person who has the power both in your work and in this political moment is the viewer. It's the individual who can make different choices with how they interact with the art, how they choose to experience it, but also how they choose to act in their lives when the app is closed. And so with that, I just want to thank you for what I think was a really wonderful conversation. It was an absolute delight and pleasure to hear more about your work and your pedagogy and what you're doing with your actual, just everything. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And you just, that was such a beautiful, there's no way I could improve on what you just said. That was such a beautiful summary. And I wish that we could, just broadcast that, because it really is in the hands of the person who's using it. And that is my fondest hope, is that it won't provoke despair, but will in fact lead people to action, meaningful action.
Amazing.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been such a fun conversation.
Same here. Samesies is what I'll say to that.